My brother was born, and my father decides to absolutely ignore me. Basically cut me out of his life, and I'm just not his daughter anymore. Well, the joke's on him, because a few years later, after some very traumatic stuff happens in the family, he comes crawling back to me, trying to make amends for how he treated me all those years. My parents got divorced when I was 11. That had been the toughest, or maybe one of the toughest phases of my life. Before the divorce, I had to deal with the constant fights and early morning arguments my parents always had. It took a toll on my mental health, making my grades in school drop. Teachers noticed, and my principal called for my parents to have a private session with them regarding my dropping grades. At first, in the morning, I'd woken up to the sound of their shushed quarreling, and as soon as they saw me, they had covered up and became those cute little lovebirds I once knew. But as time went on, they paid no attention to my presence anymore, and went on with their shouting and blaming right in front of me. It was soul-wrenching to watch my parents insult and throw shade at themselves almost every single morning. Soon enough, it escalated to full-blown yelling, breaking of bottles, plates, you name it. Most times I hid in my room till they left for work, and they never noticed since they were always too lost in their hate for each other to remember they had a teenage daughter who had always been affected by their little fights. The day my parents decided on the divorce was like any other day. I'd come back from school per usual to find my parents seated quietly around the kitchen table, unlike usual times. At first, I'd been tempted to believe that they had settled their differences and been normal like other parents for once, but I knew better than to hope. As soon as I stepped into the kitchen area, my mother rushed over to me wearing a nervous grin on her face. She took my bag off my shoulder and ordered me to the chair. "I baked you cookies, Diana." My mom smiled as she handed me a plate of cookies with a cup of hot chocolate to drink. That was suspicious. My parents never did such. If they weren't too busy quarreling, then they were definitely going to be working. My mother worked at a local bank while my father was a construction engineer who specialized in the construction of buildings. Why the sudden change of attitude? I'd wondered as I chewed warily on a cookie. The cookies tasted divine, which meant my mom had spent her valuable time baking them fresh. I was beyond surprised. "You see that trip to Paris you've always wanted to have?"
"I got you tickets, honey."
My father grinned, passing me flight tickets and evidence of a booked hotel room where I would stay. My eyebrows shot up higher into my hair, and I narrowed my eyes at them. Don't get me wrong, I was happy to finally have the chance to be able to see Paris, but there was this sinking feeling in my chest and a strong gnawing feeling in my stomach as I watched my parents' awkward grins etched on their faces. I knew something was wrong. My parents were never the type to bake their daughter cookies, or just sporadically get them tickets to a country she'd always fantasized about. My parents were the kind of parents who believed in good grades, college, a good-paying white-collar job, marriage, and of course children. Well, I dropped the tickets on the plate of cookies on the table and slid a chair out, settling in, with applaud as I dropped my entire weary form on the poor chair. I'd been so tired and drained from school that my plan had been to get home, have a nice hot shower with a good long rest, before my parents came back to resume their usual drama. But somehow, they always had their ways of ruining my days without even trying. "What is it?" I straight up asked them, too stressed to beat around the bush. I might have been 12, but I wasn't too stupid or naive not to know something was going on, and that my parents were trying really hard to bribe their way out easily. Or maybe they were trying to get me to react less angry or hurt by whatever it was they were about to say to me. My mom spoke first to break the silence with 5 words. "We decided to get divorced." She'd always been the classy businesswoman who had no time for small talk or sugarcoating her words. She always made sure she hit the nail on the head no matter how much it hurt, and at a moment it felt like someone actually had hit a nail on my head. I was stunned. Yes, I hated the fights they always had, but that never meant I wanted them divorced. I had been hoping they would realize what the problem was one day and settle their differences, but they did not. They never tried to. A 12-year-old me stared from my mom to my dad, tears threatening to roll down my cheeks. And I choked out a strangled, "Why?" My mom rushed to wrap her hands around me as my body quacked with sobs. I tried to stop her with a raised hand, shouting daggers at her when she tried to step closer again. She stopped trying to come closer when she realized how hurt and angry I truly was. She sighed and rested her back against the table and looked down at her feet. My head was filled with so many thoughts, I didn't need her clouding my head as well. My dad had said it was for the best that he knew their constant fights had taken a toll on me, and they were willing to sacrifice anything for me. He had made his words sound so appealing. If they weren't my parents, I would have thought how nice they were. But I knew it was never for me. Just another of their selfish choices. I'd stared at my parents for a long, excruciating few seconds, hurt that didn't care what effect their decision to divorce would take on me. My mom had given one of the usual long speeches she used on her clients to convince them, to try to make me see their reasonings, which I didn't. After that day, my parents' lawyer frequented the home. Lots of documents were signed, and even the 12-year-old me had been given a few to sign myself. My mom wanted to take custody of me, but my father had won against her in court, making me have to stay in school with him till I was 18 years of age. To be honest, I didn't really have a preference for who I could have liked to stay with back then. But now, as I sit thinking about it, I think it would not have been as bad as if it had been if I stayed with Mom instead of Dad. After the divorce, my mother left. I went to visit her a couple times in the new house that she moved into before she finally moved out to a different state entirely. The day she left was the last time I saw her till now. She called a couple times asking about my well-being and all, but that was pretty much it. She moved on. She met some rich guy later on, and they've made plans to get married. A wedding which she invited me to, but I couldn't make it. She called more often than telling me about how her perfect guy was that she met. She sang praises of his riches, which oftentimes made me wonder if she'd chosen him because of his money. She talked about how she wanted me to come stay with her when I was done with high school, but I did not. I didn't want to have anything to do with her or my father anymore. My dad did not take long before he remarried either. A few weeks after my mom moved out of our house, he started seeing a lady who taught in an elementary school downtown. When they were courting, she had come to visit a few times and was exceptionally nice to me. It was good. Things seemed to be better than it was when Mom stayed with us. My hopes got high again, and I thought maybe things weren't so bad after all. After a few months of dating, my dad had come elated one day and had happily broken the news of his engagement to me. Well, I had mixed feelings about things. I still loved my mom, and I felt I was going to be betraying her if I took an active role in the preparation for my father's wedding to his new wife. I was also happy I would be able to see the lady more often as we clicked so well. But, I was scared of the past repeating itself. My parents' failed marriage had been etched deeply into my mind, and it still affected me even to today. I find it hard to commit to someone I love, because I feel we could fall off later in the future. It was the same way the 12-year-old me felt about my dad remarrying. I didn't want to have to witness my father and this new lady go through another fight and scream as they cursed and swore at each other whenever they were in the same room. The wedding was a success. Everything at home was going perfectly. My dad spent more time at home, and his new wife treated me like I was truly her daughter. Well, Daddy loved me, and I was happy. My grades in school were picking up again, and I even had a love life. The principal called me into her office one day to give me a speech about not letting circumstances determine the outcome of whatever I was doing in life.
Months go by. Everything was normal and settled in.
I was the perfect daughter and stepdaughter with friends and good grades. I made sure I did all the chores in the house without stressing either dad or stepmom out. One day, I came home to a happy atmosphere. It was a usual occurrence in the house, but that day was truly different. The sitting room was decorated with lights, and the dining had been set for a candle-lit dinner. The sweet aroma of food greeting my nostrils as I walked further into the home. My stepmom had rushed in from the kitchen to hug me, and as soon as I stepped through the door with a shriek of laughter, I later found out
she was pregnant.
Precisely 3 months have gone by, and I was happy, elated even. I'd always wanted a sibling, and I was happy I was finally going to be getting one. I couldn't wait for the baby to arrive. As the pregnancy grew, my dad got busier. He spent every little time he had with his wife and barely talked to me or asked me about how I was faring. The only few times he talked to me were when he needed to know what he should get from the stores.
Or when he needed to know anything concerning his pregnant wife.
Don't get me wrong. I was happy. I was going to be a big sister. But I hated the fact that I was invisible to everyone, including my stepmom, who had almost been like my best friend, by the way. She barely noticed me at this point, and all she did was send me unnecessary errands around the home, and just nag all day if I ever made the slightest little mistake. One day, I was in my room trying to get a project my calculus teacher had given me when my stepmom yelled my name, like she was fond of doing recently. I ran down the stairs at the speed of light, only for her to tell me not to worry anyone. She claimed she didn't really crave what she called me to get her anymore. Yeah, I was furious. I understood she was pregnant and that pregnant women tended to be indecisive, but the calling and never mind thing was becoming a regular occurrence that she always seemed to enjoy doing, especially when I was trying to get something important done. I got angry and told her how I felt about how things were. I unleashed all the pent-up anger and told her about how no one really paid attention to me anymore since she got pregnant. I agree I had said the wrong way, but 12-year-old, I just needed the love and the attention, and she was robbing me blind of it. She took it the wrong way and exploded, absolutely swearing at me. She called me names, insulted my mother, claiming if my mother had paid me and my father the attention I was crying so desperately for, my father would not have sought a divorce, thereby getting married to her. I ran from the sitting room to my room and cried myself to sleep, after talking to my best friend who claimed it was the pregnancy making my stepmother so cranky. So later that day, I heard pounding on my door, and upon opening the door, "Who the duck do you think you are?" is what I heard. My father had thundered at me, making me cower back in fear. Apparently, my stepmother had to tell my father that what had transpired that afternoon between us as soon as he got back home.
And she didn't just tell him the way it happened.
She had added a little bit of her own specially formulated spice of lies to make me look really bad in my father's sight. And guys, it worked. My dad had busted my room shouting and screaming profanities at me as his precious dear wife. My stepmother stood at the door watching unbothered, almost enjoying the show like a pay-per-view. She had told him that I wished she was never pregnant so he would not have to take his attention away from me. She had made him believe I would get rid of her child happily if an opportunity presented itself, and my father acted out of anger. A few days later, my dad apologized for how he talked to me and agreed to have elected. He promised he was going to pay more attention to me now. Things changed a little. No, a lot. My stepmom looked every possible way to get some nasty reaction from me, constantly annoying me, but I ignored her most of the time. As time went on, I spent less time at home with that excuse of, my best friend had lessons together. Months later, the baby arrived, a handsome baby boy, and my father fell in love with him at first sight. The baby had almost all the features of my father had, unlike me, who had taken most of my mother's features. The baby had the same round hazel eyes my dad had. His cheekbones were exactly like my father's, including his hair color. My father, who had kept his promise to looking out for me, had gone back to ignoring me as soon as the baby arrived. He barely noticed me or anything I did. He doted on the baby like a kid who had gotten a new toy. My father spent more time home, but it was always with my stepmother and her son. Well, things went on like that as the years went by, and I got used to not being noticed by father or stepmom. I got used to the gifts and praises my dad showered on my stepbrother, but never on me. I got used to the loneliness and started looking for ways to fill the hole my father's disregard had caused. So I dated a few boys, sneaked out to parties to get drunk, and feel less pained about being invisible to my own family. I caused a few troubles in school. I was ready to do anything that would make my father notice I even existed if it was negative. Everything was the way it was, and I waited through till my stepbrother clocked 5 years of age. For each of my stepbrother's birthdays, my father always threw a party while he got me only cakes for mine. On my 16th birthday, my father had got me nothing, and to say I wasn't hurt would be a lie. For my stepbrother's 5th birthday, my dad threw a massive party, and I was used as the caterer and chef who ran around the house serving drinks and food. It was the talk of the town for days. It was etched on my mind for days until my stepbrother fell ill. My stepbrother Adam and I barely shared any sibling bonds. My stepmom had stopped him from talking to me, and the little boy had grown to regard me as a distant relative. But that night, I had heard someone knock on my room door weekly, and I've gone to check to wonder if it was my father. It was Adam, and my curiosity grew when I took his pale and tiny frame. For the first time in years, I actually also noticed the little boy, who I'd grown to regard as another unpleasant piece of furniture in the house. "What's wrong?" I'd asked him worriedly, letting him into my room before closing the door shut. I hoped against all odds that his mother would not come in search of him, else I would have to deal with her insults and the embarrassment of her dragging the little boy out of my room. "My head always hurts. I'm cold. I feel tired, Sister Diana." Adam had sniffed weakly, settling his unusually scrawny form on my unorganized bed. He looked up at me, tears falling down his face as he shivered. "Why don't you tell Mommy?" I asked, surprised as to why he would meet me instead of his mom. "I can't. My eyes, head, everywhere hurts, Sister Diana." Adam repeated again, crying harder. I took my stepbrother in my arms, noticing how almost weightless he was, and raced off to my father's room. My father acted quickly, woke my stepmom up, and they took off to the hospital with me. As I sat that night in the back of the car with my father driving like a wild dog, I couldn't help but notice my stepbrother's shallow breathing. I let out a shriek of panic when I saw the blood run down Adam's nose. I screamed at my father, telling him Adam was bleeding as I pressed his shirt tightly to his nose to stoke the blood in. My father drove faster at that moment, and soon enough we arrived at the hospital. The doctors wheeled my stepbrother away in a stretcher to the emergency room, leaving my dad sunken and my stepmom's sassy attitude evaporated. Everything was a blur of doctors, needles, and tests for the next few days. My stepbrother was in pain, and from the look on my father's and stepmother's face, I could tell it broke their heart to see their precious son look like that. But strangely, I didn't feel sad. I felt like I did every day. Empty. Finally, after what I felt like was an eternity, we got a diagnosis. My stepbrother has cancer. I'd heard of cancer before, but didn't really understood what it meant until then. My father was devastated, and he spent countless nights in the hospital with my stepbrother, holding his hand and comforting him. I could see how much he loved him, and I was sad that he could not be there for me as he was with Adam. But at the same time, I felt sorry for my father as well. I was used to being invisible to him. He had neglected me ever since Adam was born, but now, with his illness, it was like I didn't even exist anymore. My father was so consumed with worry and fear for my brother that I was almost dead to him as well. Days rolled into weeks, and well, weeks rolled into months. We'd grown to live with the fact that Adam could never be normal anymore. He was always in and out of the hospitals and had to stop schooling as he took treatments for cancer. Life got worse for me, and any little thing I did triggered my stepmother, and she would yell and scream profanities at me. My dad became a ghost of himself, making me not able to ask him for anything. I started working later on in a restaurant to earn money I could use for my needs, and also so I would hardly be around at home. I saved up for college when I was 17, and in my last year in high school, that was the only thing that kept me going, and not insane. I threaded around the house like a ghost, trying to make as little noise as possible to not trigger my stepmother, who found faults in every single thing I did. Most of the food I ate was given to me by my boss at work, who suspected things were not really good at home. And months after Adam was diagnosed with cancer, the doctor called for a family meeting where he disclosed to us that Adam had a year and a few months to live at the most. That was the final arrow my father needed to break. Completely. He began to drink and came home later than he always did. He screamed at me and threw things at me for the slightest mistakes. Home became absolutely a disaster, and I buried myself harder into schoolwork so I could make good grades, and into my work as well so I could make money to sponsor my college. The end of the school year rolled around, and I graduated. My father could not attend my graduation ceremony due to the fact that he had to see the doctor on the day of my graduation regarding Adam's sickness. The day of my graduation was literally the happiest day of my life. I'd applied for college in an entirely different state so I could be as far from father and stepmom, and I got admitted and awarded a half-funded scholarship. Even as I celebrated alone amidst my classmates who had come with their parents, I was still very happy. I moved out of the house into a whole different town right when I turned 18. Things got better and worse for me. I had to work double shifts at a cafe and also keep up with the numerous projects the lectures gave us to do in college. I was barely surviving, but I didn't also have to deal with my dad and stepmom's constant nagging and disgust for me. I was in control of my life, and even though I was broke, I had peace. My father barely called unless he had something to ask me, and even when he did, he was always quick to end the call with the usual excuse of my brother needed his time. I wasn't hurt by that statement anymore. I knew I wasn't as important as him to Adam was. I'd grown to live with that bitter truth that it didn't hurt anymore. Adam had been holding on, but just barely, like a cancer patient who fights valiantly against the disease. With each passing day, his once robust frame grew weaker, his steps more tentative. The sadness etched into my father's face betrayed his heartache, for he knew all too well that Adam's time with us was very limited. Last week my father called me. I thought it was one of his usual calls. Upon picking up, I heard a small voice saying, "Sister." I was shocked Adam was calling me. He called to ask for a favor, which was to forgive my father. Apparently, he's regretting the way he treated me. In tears, I told Adam that I would. It was the first request he's ever made of me, but the truth is I really can't. I just didn't want to agitate little Adam. What's up, everybody? Mr. Reddito here. Wow, this story is a sad one and an intense one. There's a few updates. They're pretty small. There's 3 of them, but let's go ahead and see what's going on.
Update number 1. Wow, my story's really getting attention. Thank you for all your comments in the comment section and the help. Some of you asked why I could not forgive my father even after my brother begged me. Well, the truth is, my father never even apologized in the first place. Also, if you were in my shoes, would you? To those of you who asked how Adam's health was, well, Adam's gone. He's finally given up the ghost. It was early Sunday morning when my best friend called me and her voice was low and heavy with sadness to deliver the bad news. He's dead, Diana. She had sobbed out onto the phone, and I didn't need to ask her who was dead. There was just one person I knew that could be dead, and it was my sick little brother, Adam. My mind went blank, and my little brother, after fighting cancer for over a year, had decided to give up the ghost. I didn't blame him. He had been too young to face such a pain. I disconnected the phone call and sat in bed for a few long minutes lost in my own thoughts. Adam and I didn't have that typical sibling relationship, but I had hoped silently in my heart that he would survive. I couldn't imagine the hurt my father must be feeling, and even though I hated the way he treated me, I still felt pity for him. As I sat on the bed, my phone still pressed to my ears, I felt a wave of grief wash amongst me. I couldn't believe that my stepbrother was gone. I spent the next few days in a daze. I didn't know how to process my grief, and I felt guilty for not being there for my brother during his illness. Update 2. Your words of condolences meant a lot to me. Thank you all. For those who asked whether I attended Adam's funeral, I could not, due to the fact that I had college exams. I wanted to call father, but my pride wouldn't let me. I hadn't contacted him in 6 months, and I had nothing to say to him. If I did so, I didn't. I might have been grieving Adam, but that didn't mean I forgave my father for all the years of neglect. I thought the previous updates would be my last, but today, I see myself coming here to update once again. Months after the burial of Adam, I trudged back to my apartment after a particularly long and dreary lecture. Eager just to flop down on my bed and forget about the stresses of the day. As I reached for the doorknob, I noticed a small envelope propped against the doorframe. Curious, I picked it up and flipped it over, to find my name scrawled across the front in my father's familiar handwriting. I hesitated for a moment. My heart was pounding in my chest as I tore open the envelope and pulled out a neatly folded letter inside. As I read through the words, my eyes grew wide and shock and disbelief set in. My father, who had neglected and abandoned me in favor of my stepbrother, was reaching out to me after months of silence. He was asking to meet up, fix things between us, apologizing for the hurt he caused and expressing regret for the way that he's treated me. He wrote a long letter explaining why he acted the way he acted, and I reminded him so much of my mother that he hated to be reminded. I couldn't believe it. I'd spent so long resenting my father for his neglect, nursing deep-seated anger and the hurt that had never fully healed, and now, just as my stepbrother passed, and he had nothing else to spend his time on, he suddenly remembers he has a daughter. I sat down on the stoop outside my apartment, the letter clutched tightly in my hands as I tried to process the flood of emotions coursing through me. Part of me had wanted to throw the letter away and never look back, to hold on to the anger and hurt that had defined my relationship with my father for so long. But another part of me, a part that always longed for my father's love and approval, was tempted by the possibility of reconciliation. I had stared at the letter for a long time, anger and hope coursing through my veins, making my heart throb in absolute pain and misery. I was hurt that my father only remembered me after the death of Adam. It made me seem like I was second option to him, and my heart broke, and now as I sat in front of the screen on my computer, the option I had to choose from were imprinted in the back of my mind. Do I forgive my father and try to patch things up, or do I hold on to my anger and never forgive him? Was it too late for this reconcile? Update number 3, final update. Guys, I see a lot of comments condemning me for even thinking about not forgiving him, saying that I should understand his plight, but he's my father too. I mean, he should have been there for me, right? The negligence started even before my brother was born. It's not easy to forgive that. To deal with the hurt and pain, well, I'm now in therapy. My therapist says I need to vent and tell my father how I feel, so I drove to his house last weekend. The previous time we spoke, he did more of the talking, and now I'm doing the talking. I've never seen my dad cry so much in my life. My stepmother was also there, and well, she looked horrible. After the confrontation, I feel better. I feel like a lot of things are off my chest, so last night I called my father to check on him. He sounded very ecstatic. I guess, well, you would call that the road to healing. I just want to give a big thank you to everyone, and you're all my support system all throughout this ordeal.
So guys, this story was a very sad one. Whenever someone ever dies that young, it's beyond comprehension of sadness, but at least in the end of this story, OP was into therapy and starting to mend the relationship with the father, because I don't want to exactly paint the father as the worst guy ever. He went through something very traumatic, and yes, he didn't really treat his daughter right, distanced himself from her, but at the same time, I just have to realize that he lost his son, and the stepmother was going through some crazy things too. Guys, I want to hear from y'all. What would you do if you were the daughter, and you weren't getting much attention, and you knew that your brother had cancer? How would you react to that situation? It's such a tough one. Drop your comments down below, guys. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing. I hope you guys have an amazing day. I will be back tomorrow with another story. I hope to see you then.